Chapter 11, Virtue Ethics, Part 1 and 2. Moodily staring at her food, Ashley was sitting alone in the company lunchroom. Lost in thought, she nearly jumped out of her chair as someone shouted, "Hey, Ashley!" right behind her. She turned just as Lauren, one of those teddy bear types of people you can't help but liking, banged her plate down on Ashley's right. Lauren's big grin turned into a frown as she caught sight of Ashley's face. "What's up?" Lauren asked. "Oh, nothing," Ashley replied. "That's a lie, lady," Lauren shot back. "You look sadder than the hash browns on my plate." Ashley gave a little laugh. "Well," she said, "just got that promotion I applied for, which means I can head up the office in Durham." "Fantastic!" Lauren boomed as she gave Ashley a hug. "You've been on that for ages, and it'll be awesome to do purchasing through you instead of old Joe down there. The Carolinas have nice weather, too." Lauren gave Ashley another glance. "So what's the problem?" she asked. "Oh, I don't think I can take the job." Ashley's words suddenly poured out. "Mike's mom isn't doing well, and neither of us feel comfortable leaving her up here alone, and there's no way she could handle a move." "No other family nearby?" Lauren asked. "No, we're all she has," Ashley answered. "And though she insists we can go, it'd be really hard on her. If we leave the area, I think she would shrivel up and die." "Yeah," Lauren said. "But isn't your career important too?" "Sure," Ashley replied. "But still, it's just a job." "What does Mike say?" Lauren asked. "Oh, he says it's up to me. Although I think he wants to stay near his mom. In fact, I think I made up my mind to stay. I just couldn't let Mike's mom down." Lauren looked at her thoughtfully. "You know what?" Lauren asked after a long pause. "I really respect you. Not everyone would do what you're doing." So, this brings up a question. Is Ashley's decision to stay and not take the job a moral decision? And if so, what are the moral principles that would apply in this case? Well, it doesn't seem that Ashley would be doing wrong either way. The choice she does make earns Lauren's respect, and this respect includes a strong moral element. Yet, could Ashley's choice be universalized into a moral law following Kant's categorical imperative? That seems unlikely, although the alternative can't be either. Will Ashley's choice increase utility? That's not clear, but even if it decreases utility, it seems to deserve respect. Or better, Ashley herself deserves respect, as Lauren says. So, to use a sort of outmoded sounding term here, we might want to say that Ashley in this case appears to be virtuous. This leads us to virtue ethics. So, some moral problems don't seem to involve any moral principles at all. Instead, to arrive at a moral judgment, we must think through such problems using a pattern of moral reflection similar to what was presented at the end of Chapter 4, Part 5, if we remember when we were talking about moral reflection. There may not even be a single definite right answer about what the moral choice would be, and we're going to see this. We're going to have the opportunity to talk about it. A way to understand such cases is offered by virtue theory. Virtue theory can be understood from two different perspectives. As just described, and in keeping with the approach taken by so-called principle-based theories, we might call people virtuous simply meaning that they do what prescriptive moral principles tell them to do. In this view, prescriptive moral principles are more basic, and virtue becomes just the derived concept about keeping principles, right? So the virtuous thing to do just means that you follow whatever it is your moral principles are. The virtue theorist's alternative perspective reverses this entirely, as we'll see. In their view, personal character, virtue, it's the primary thing. Moral theory begins by describing the kind of person one should be, not by saying what one should do. So the idea is that we're explaining what kind of person a virtuous person is, not starting by saying what a virtuous person should do. First and foremost, Morality calls us to become virtuous persons, developing the attitudes and skills needed to live morally. Right actions, what we should do, are then derived from the virtue. So right actions describe what a virtuous person would do, or what springs from a virtuous character. Virtue-based theories take a different approach to ethics from that of principle-based theories. This reversal is virtue theory's most distinctive feature. And sort of following from this, we can break up the three features we're going to talk about into the first, primacy of character, the second, character motivation, and the third, that these theories can lead to several right choices. So, as far as primacy of character, virtue theory maintains that our essential moral responsibility is to develop a virtuous personal character. This is a character full of virtues. Right actions are then the things a virtuous person would typically do. We can look back to Chapter 5, Part 2, if we want a reminder about moral character and how we want to understand that. In addition, most virtue theories affirm the following. Character motivation. So virtue theories attribute a person's motivation for acting morally directly to this person's character, not to any duty or principle. Ashley's question of what she should do is not a question of what duties are imposed from outside, but what her loyalty and compassion calls forth from within. She consults no external principle, as we saw, but arrives at her decision once her mind, will, and emotions all fall into unity. Her sympathies and desires draw her to her decision, her deliberation aligned with those desires, and her will almost effortlessly agreed. In virtue theory, virtuous actions arise from the person herself. Once someone has established a virtuous character, as we'll see, it becomes relatively easy for her to act virtuously. Unfortunately, this can work in other ways as well. If someone has formed a vicious character, and this of course comes from the word vice, or a bad character trait, then it'll be easy to act badly, but hard to do well or to act virtuously. As experience teaches us, people tend to do what comes most naturally to them. And we quickly notice that when someone is acting out of character, for example, when the vicious person acts well or when the virtuous person acts badly, we notice this because it's out of character. It's what it means to be out of character. By locating moral motivation in the character of the whole person, virtue theory largely avoids the problem of how to muster the willpower to do right? The right thing just follows from our character, not from our willpower. These two features come closest to defining virtue theory, though some share certain additional implications. And here is one additional implication of interest. This is several right choices. Virtue theory can allow for different choices to count as equally right in the same situation, which might seem a little bit weird, but as we'll see, it'll make perfect sense, because different virtuous people might choose to act differently. If moral principles alone cannot provide a complete ethics, then in some situations, no principle will determine what the right thing to do is. Our moral thinking will then resemble moral reflection rather than moral reasoning. You may have already noticed the similarities between Ashley's story and the child dying of cancer that was discussed in Chapter 4. This is when moral reflection was discussed. Virtue theory is usually considered an instance of moral particularism, which sees moral judgments as depending heavily on each particular situation, especially the moral character of those involved, rather than on moral principles. Of course, this doesn't entail that there's no right act at all, and this is really important. Virtue ethics isn't saying that every act can be right. In keeping with virtue theory's primacy of character, the right thing to do is what a virtuous person would do. But since different virtuous people might act differently in, say, Alicia's position, virtue theory can allow for more than one morally right option for the same situation. This doesn't turn virtue theory into a type of moral subjectivism, however. Although it allows for a range of right actions, it doesn't allow anything at all to be morally acceptable. While several options might be right, all others can still be wrong. Thus, it's appropriate to treat virtue theory as an objectivist theory. Nevertheless, there's no denying that its several right choices feature distinguishes virtue theory from principle-based theories in an intriguing way. Now we're going to go on to expand on virtue theory and to look at a classic example of it in the philosophy of Aristotle.